Straight talk from Israel. You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio. You're listening to the Jay Shapiro Show.
Hello again, this is Jay Shapiro. Thanks for listening. Israel's most important ally and one is the United States, and one of the United States' most important allies is Israel, the one country in the Middle East that it can rely upon. So let's say a word about the Biden administration, which is less than 1 year old. The Biden administration has revealed itself to be a calamity that must be blamed on either incompetence or worse, a captive of special interests whose agenda has nothing to do with protecting America's future or the future of America's allies. The president's popularity to date has declined to its lowest level since he was sworn in, with half of the nation's adults disapproving of his performance, according to a report by Reuters. Not surprisingly, the dramatic plummet began following his disastrous retreat from Afghanistan that will see countless Afghans executed for embracing American democratic principles. In other words, America's allies are being punished for being allies of America. So in a sense, we are witnessing a hinge of history that will determine whether America will continue as a respected world power, and it will be decided in very large measure by those who may well have chosen power and profits over patriotism. And this is especially true in a relationship to Iran, which will soon be a nuclear power threatening the very existence of the State of Israel. We are at a cusp in history very, very different than any that has occurred since the 1930s. I'll be back after the break.
The return of the Jewish people to the land of Israel was prophesied in the Bible thousands of years ago and is coming true today. Shalom. Join me, Josh Wander, on Israel Unplugged. Listen in as we delve into the spiritual and physical aspects of the Jewish return to Zion. We'll discuss the biblically mandated, historic, and of course practical understandings of this incredible transition from exile to redemption. That's Israel Unplugged, every Monday on IsraelNewsTalkRadio.com.
You're listening to the Jay Shapiro Show.
You're back with Jay Shapiro. It is a given that bipartisan support in the American Congress is important for the State of Israel. I don't have to give reasons for this because Israel and the United States cooperate with each other in many fields. Israel gets a lot of money from the United States, but it also provides a lot of information to the United States in many fields, particularly technological, and Israel is America's major and most stable friend in this part of the world. Now, this bipartisan support has run into some problems now because of a group called the Squad, which is 5 or 6 members of the U.S. House of Representatives who are extremely anti-Israel. And what they did was, most recently, about a week ago, was they picked on the Iron Dome to make a stand against Israel. The Iron Dome is money that is given to Israel for Israel to protect itself by the Iron Dome system, which was provided by the United States, and improvements to which were made by the state of Israel that were good for use by the United States in other areas. The bottom line is that thousands upon thousands of rockets have been fired to Israel, most recently in the war with the Gaza Strip, and we have to call it a war, back in May. And of course, because of that, it depleted the supply of the Iron Dome rockets, and the idea of this bill was to replenish the supply. And as I said, the so-called squad in the House of Representatives voted against it, although it happened to pass by a congressional trick, but that's not important. The Iron Dome, as I said, is a system developed jointly by the United States and Israel that is purely defensive. Doesn't kill, injure, or threaten anyone. It only protects civilians against war crimes committed by terrorist groups that direct lethal rockets against innocent civilians. That's the whole purpose of the Iron Dome. The fact that the squad would try to deny Israel the right to defend itself speaks volumes about the lack of morality and decency among squad members and their allies. It follows then from this effort that the squad will oppose any and all aid to Israel, and including protecting its innocent civilians against Iran's nuclear threat. That's the next big threat. You have the threat of rockets from Gaza, and you have the major threat of a nuclear weapon from Iran. The obvious goal of the squad members is to deny Israel the right to defend itself against this kind of aggression. By the way, one of the members of the squad has denied that Israel has the right to exist. Now, the truth of the matter is that these actions directly violate the platform of the Democratic Party as well as that of the Republican Party. So the Democratic Party now must decide whether it will become captive to its most extreme wing, anti-Israel ring, or else it will marginalize these radicals, but in a sense are not only anti-Israel, but in many ways are anti-American. They are intolerant of dissent and due process for those who disagree with them. They are anti-police on the domestic level, anti-military on the domestic level, and they're also anti-free market economy in the United States. A time has come, and as a matter of fact, it's long past, for the Democratic leadership to take a stand against the squad. The leadership can no longer stand idly by the bigotry of the members of the squad. If the Democratic Party persists in tolerating the intolerable, they'll lose the support of the mainstream voters. And I'm not speaking just about the Jewish voters. And that's a very serious thing. The squad is a small group of radical members of the U.S. House of Representatives who run for Congress every 2 years as Democrats. However, they do not reflect the mainstream policies of the Democratic Party. They represent districts that are not typical of the Democratic base. They could not be elected in a statewide race because they lack widespread support. They were nominated because of low turnout in primaries and were elected because their districts are overwhelmingly vote Democratic. In a sense, they can be considered fringe Democrats who should not have influence beyond their own districts. However, the problem is that the House leadership of the Democratic Party has exaggerated their significance and given them more power than they deserve. One important issue that distinguishes them from mainstream Democrats is their hatred of Israel and a willingness to deny Israel, who's America's most important Middle East ally, the means to defend its civilians against rocket attacks from terrorist organizations like Hamas and Hezbollah, as well as from Iran's nuclear program. And that is an extremely important issue. They have also, some of them have repeatedly made bigoted statements against American Jews. Now, the squad members should have been marginalized for these outrageous things. Instead, they were rewarded by the Democratic leadership by giving assignments as members of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, which is a major position. Now, the squad had managed to extort the leadership of the party into removing a $1 billion commitment to replenish Israel's Iron Dome defense system that protects civilians from rocket attacks. The squad and its Democratic allies in the House threatened to vote against an appropriation bill unless the Iron Dome allocation was removed, and they won. At least for now, the allocation was removed over the objection of mainstream Democrats and Republicans, but this was a victory for the squad. The funding is likely to be restored in subsequent legislation, which it was, but the success of the squad's maneuver may be a sign of their growing influence in the Democratic Party. The Iron Dome is purely defensive. It doesn't kill, injure, or threaten anyone. It protects civilians. In other words, the squad, by voting, or not voting, or voting against, would try to deny Israel the right to defend itself. So it says a lot about the lack of morality and decency. So the obvious goal of the squad members is to deny Israel the right to defend itself against aggression. These bigoted actions violate, as I said, the platform of the party. So now, up until recently, they could be largely ignored by voters as an allowed distraction, but now they've managed to influence legislation in a very negative manner, so they have to be taken seriously by the voters. They have to be rejected. Now, quite understandably, Republican leaders are trying to capitalize on the Democrats' capitulation to these extremists. Today, the Republicans are claiming that these people represent the future of the Democratic Party. If that were true, by the way, it would be the end of the two-party system. Since mainstream American voters do not support radical extremism, I think that the Democratic leadership must make it clear that they reject these policies. They have to take a strong stand against anti-American, anti-Israel, and anti-decency of the squad. If they insist in tolerating the intolerable, they'll lose the support of the mainstream voters. And that is a very serious problem. So it's a situation that didn't exist years ago. It didn't exist in my time. Everybody I knew when I was a kid voted Democratic. The Democratic Party is in danger of giving in to this fringe group that will affect the party itself, not just Israel. Of course, how it affects Israel is the main problem right now, but it's a situation that we really have to keep an eye on it. It's important for the Israelis to do a good job of lobbying in the United States to explain why the Squad is not just a threat to Israel, it's a threat to American democracy. I'll be back after the break.
Hi, I'm Steve Miller.
And I'm Matt Zucker.
Join us for Lighten Up, where we take a look at the week's current events in Israel and from around the Jewish world through a humorous lens.
If you've been paying attention during these crazy times, you know that it's a challenge to parody life anymore. But join Steve and I as we give it the old college try. Not only is being happy an obligation, but life is just too short to take it all so seriously.
So join me, Steve Miller.
And me, Matt Zucker.
For Lighten Up every Monday morning at 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, 5 p.m. Israel, only on IsraelNewsTalkRadio.com.
You're listening to The Jay Shapiro Show.
You're back with Jay Shapiro. Since the disastrous American withdrawal from Afghanistan, I've spoken about it for a number of reasons. First of all, we have to watch the behavior of the United States, which is our primary ally, and the way the United States behaves under pressure, or even not under pressure, is important to us. And secondly, as I said, the disastrous repeat from Afghanistan has made the Middle East a much more dangerous place, and of course, that is Israel's neighborhood. Not only did the Biden administration hand the Taliban and the mullahs of Iran a major political and strategic victory, it also rewarded them with sophisticated, state-of-the-art U.S. weapons worth $85 billion, paid for, by the way, by the American taxpayer, while these terrorists will undoubtedly use to launch even more deadly attacks like 9/11 and kill the American taxpayers who paid for their new strategic weaponry. But also, they may use these things against Israel or to give these things to terrorists to use against Israel. For example, the Biden administration actually delivered 7 brand new helicopters just a month before announcing it withdrawing from the country. The truth of the matter is, the best word to use is mind-boggling, that the Biden administration announced a withdrawal from Afghanistan without any plans either to secure billions of dollars of U.S. military equipment, didn't make the slightest effort to recover or destroy this military equipment, which, heaven forbid, may be used against Israel. So the chances are that the Taliban and the Iranian regime that supports it now are not only able to unleash U.S.-made weapons against the U.S. and its allies, but Iran, Russia, and China can also utilize this military equipment for research, reverse engineering, reproducing, and selling it in order to harm the United States. This is a really bad situation created by the Biden administration. And also, The Taliban's takeover is seen as an opportunity by the Iranian regime, which already has terrorists in Lebanon. They seize this a chance to set up terrorist groups to shelter them, such as Al-Qaeda, who also hold a deep hatred toward the United States and Israel. So it's a very, very serious situation caused by what Biden did. The Biden administration, and you got to lay this right out on the table, the Biden administration has provided planes, guns, night vision goggles. They have 2,000 armored vehicles, including Humvees, up to 40 aircraft, possibly including Black Hawk helicopters and Scout attack helicopters and military drones. So it was a terrible thing. It's going to be it's mind-boggling that the Biden administration announced will withdraw with any plans to secure these items. So it is a serious situation for the entire Western world, but in particular, it is a serious situation for Israel. As a matter of fact, Marco Rubio, a senator from Florida, said in a letter to the State Department, it is unconscionable that high-tech military equipment paid for by U.S. taxpayers has fallen into the hands of the Taliban and its terrorist allies. Securing U.S. assets should have been the top priority for the U.S. Department of Defense prior to announcing the withdrawal from Afghanistan. And since we're on the subject, I want to quote what former President Donald Trump wrote. Never in history has a withdrawal from war been handled so badly or incompetently as the Biden administration's withdrawal from Afghanistan. In addition to the obvious, all equipment should be demanded to be immediately returned to the United States, and that includes every penny of the $85 billion in costs. It's not handed back. The U.S. should either go in with unequivocal military force and get it, or at least bomb the hell out of it. Nobody ever thought such stupidity as this feeble-brained withdrawal was. Former President Trump has a tendency to speak very strongly, but what he says makes sense. And a couple of representatives in the House of Representatives, Republicans, members of the House Oversight and Reform Committee, sent a letter to U.S. Defense Secretary, and they said, we're left wondering if the Biden administration has a plan to prevent the Taliban from using our weapons against U.S. allies or the U.S. or selling them to foreign adversaries like China, Russia, Iran, or North Korea. Apparently, there are no plans in the offing, and that is very, very dangerous for the Western world and in particular for Israel. Now I want to switch topics, but I want to say something about how important it is for Israel to strengthen itself in the U.S. Congress. A congressman from Michigan, a Democrat named Andy Levin, I have to assume he's Jewish, is set to introduce a bill that would make a two-state solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict official U.S. policy. Is pushing for a two-state solution with its capital in East Jerusalem, calling for an end to the occupation, makes no reference to the Palestinian Authority's pay-for-slave policy, the fact that the West Bank, which we call Judea and Samaria, is the biblical homeland of the Jewish people, that the two-state solution was declared in 1947, but when the UN divided Palestine, the Arab countries attacked the Jewish state, and there is never in history has there been a Palestinian state. According to a magazine called Politico, if Congress passes and President Joe Biden signs the Two-State Solution Act, American policy on the Israel-Palestinian conflict will formally state the following: the only outcome of a two-state solution that can both ensure the state of Israel's survival as a democratic state and a national home for the Jewish people, and fulfill the legitimate aspirations of the Palestinian people for a state of their own, that the West Bank, which including East Jerusalem and Gaza, are occupied territories and should be referred to as such consistently in U.S. policies, that the establishment of Israeli settlements in the occupied Palestinian territories is inconsistent with international law, that the settlement expansion, demolition of Arab homes, revocations of residency permits, and forced eviction of Palestinian civilians by Israel impede the establishment of a Palestinian state and violate the human rights of the Palestinian people. This is all the thing declared by this Democratic representative in Congress. And that is the fact on the ground. Total disregard of reality, total disregard of history. It is mind-boggling that a congressman could be so really stupid and ignorant of what's been happening in the Middle East for the last 150 years. And it really is dangerous that there are, to the state of Israel, that there are these kinds of people in the U.S. Congress still repeating the same old propaganda and the same old lies that have proven to be entirely false. It really is terrible that there are those kinds of people in the American Congress. I don't know if there are any tests for members of Congress before they can run for office. Do they know the U.S. Constitution? Do they know American history? Do they know Middle East history? Do they know anything about the subjects that they're going to have to vote on? It's interesting. Apparently not, and we're left with the results, which can be dangerous to the state of Israel. I just wanted to share these thoughts with the listeners, particularly the Americans, to get an idea of what your congressmen know and do not know. And that is a very, very serious problem. You can run for Congress, get elected, and not know a darn thing about the things you're going to vote on. I'll be back after the break.
Are you tired of political correctness and the fear that you might offend someone?
I'm not afraid to offend you.
Wow, look who's talking tough.
One has to be tough to keep sane today.
Hi, I'm Alan Skorsky.
And I'm Beulah Seabrow.
And join us every Wednesday for The Definitive Wrap as we interview the most sought-after guests and expose progressive trends that masquerade as enlightenment but actually destroy our freedoms.
We are the No Woke Zone, so buckle up to this exciting show.
Buckling up, but I'm driving.
Sure, you can drive, but I'm the navigator.
Tune in for the No Nonsense, The Definitive Wrap Show, every Wednesday on Israel News Talk Radio.
You've come to the best station for hot news and sizzling commentary.
You're listening to The Jay Shapiro Show.
You're back with Jay Shapiro. I saw a very interesting column in the Jerusalem Post the day before the last day of Sukkot, and it's by Eli Kavon, who's the rabbi of a congregation in West Palm Beach, Florida, and he's a friend of mine. We're always in contact, so I asked his permission to use the column in my program, which of course he gave me permission. So I want to share it with the listeners because I found it interesting and enlightening. It says the following: Israel Independence Day and Jerusalem Day are two of the most recent celebrations added to the Hebrew calendar. Holocaust Remembrance Day is another recent addition mandated by the Knesset in Israel. But these days are not universally recognized by old Jewry. We have to go back 1,000 years to find a holiday added to the calendar and celebrated by all Jews. Which brings us to Simchat Torah, which was celebrated this week. It is a holiday that has no basis in the Bible. In our 3,500-year history, Simchat Torah is a latecomer. According to scholar Philip Birnbaum, the rejoicing of the Torah was not known in Talmudic times as the name of a special festival marking the annual completion of the reading of the Torah. In Babylonia, where the one-year cycle for the reading of the 5 books of Moses prevailed, the marking of the completion of the reading emerged only in the 9th century. The 7 processions with the Torah scrolls became customary in the 16th century. Simchat Torah became one of the most popular of Jewish holidays despite its late appearance. In the History of Judaism, a book by historian Martin Goldberg, he writes, and I quote, "The end of Sukkot was marked by the final 8th day, called Shmini Atzeret, on which no work was to be undertaken. In the diaspora, where 2 days of the festival were observed, as indeed they are today, the second day in due course took on a character of its own in celebration of the completion of the annual cycle of the reading of the Torah and in the start of a new cycle of the reading Torah with the book of Genesis. This celebration, known as Simchat Torah, is not attested until the beginning of the second millennium in the Common Era, but it has become a major festival for diaspora Jews with much singing and dancing by the congregation. And we just had it this week. In the land of Israel, Simchat Torah was incorporated into the holiday of Shmini Atzeret, in which the two holidays essentially are celebrated on the same day. In the diaspora, it's 2 separate days. It's interesting that the celebration of Simchat Torah had its origins in the diaspora, yet it was adopted by the Jews of Israel. It attests to the supremacy of the Babylonian Gaonate and its influence throughout the Jewish world, even in Israel. At that time, back several millennia ago, there was a Jewish community in Palestine, there was a Jewish community in Babylonia, and the one in Babylonia was the bigger one, and that's where the Babylonian Talmud was created and so forth. It was Babylonia was the stronger of the two communities. Elie Wiesel highlighted this joyous celebration as a gathering of protest by those Jewish youth in Moscow who wanted to leave the Soviet Union and reclaim their Jewish heritage in Israel. Simchat Torah was not only a religious celebration, but it was a celebration of Jewish identity. That's what it developed into. And then Eli Kavon goes on to say, and this is the interesting part, Simchat Torah should embolden us to create a meaningful Jewish calendar. In other words, to modernize the calendar. If a holiday can be added to the Hebrew calendar millennia after Revelation, why can we not add holidays that address the issues of our own time and be recognized by all Jews? By the way, I think that's what Israel Independence Day and Jerusalem Day, particularly celebrated in Israel. The modern calendar has been partially successful in accomplishing this, but a religion that fails to respond to the watershed events of our own time is a religion that's bound to ossify, calcify, and fail. Jews have to have the strength of our ancestors and not fear to modify the calendar. If Simchat Torah could be incorporated into the Hebrew calendar 1,000 years ago, we can be bold and expand the Hebrew calendar of today. Unquote. So this was an article by Eli Kavon. And it's interesting, one of the things that Eli Kavon certainly doesn't say is that we should do away with any of the holidays or any of the fast days or any of the celebrations we have. What he is suggesting is we are adding new days to the calendar that correspond to what has happened more recently in our history, and that's something I myself can certainly agree to. Now I want to say a few more words about what's happening in the U.S. Congress because it does not bode well for Israel. As recently as the last Gaza war in May, when Hamas indiscriminately fired over 4,000 rockets, they fired from civilian areas in the Gaza Strip, and they aimed at civilians in Israel. In a sense, they committed over 4,000 war crimes. Support for Israel's right to defend itself came from many corners of the world. However, not so much in the American Congress. Enormous marches took place throughout the world's capitals condemning Israel, and in their wake, recorded anti-Semitic attacks increased. The most common refrain from strong Israel supporters was, Israel has a right to defend itself. Now, the truth of the matter is that the people making this statement, Israel has a right to defend itself, thought they were helping Israel, but in a real sense, they weren't. Of course, Israel has a right to defend itself. Why wouldn't it? Every country does. But even mentioning the right, you're welcome a debate whether Israel does or does not have a right to defend itself. The truth of the matter is they have to change the way they are speaking. They have to permanently change the wording. Israel has an obligation to defend itself and its citizens. All countries do. It's not a right, it's an obligation. The most basic expectation that a citizen of any country has is the expectation to safety and security. This is an obligation of the state to its citizens. It is not a right. It is not an option. It's a non-negotiable obligation. That's why states exist. When a nation does not fulfill its obligation, it questions its ability to succeed as a state. To win a war, you must choose the correct battlefield. The Democratic Party is currently negotiating Israel's surrender to the very right to exist. It's been called into question. Look at what's happened. The United States has done over the last several months. They capitulated disastrously in their retreat from Afghanistan. That's, I think, really an open wound today in America. The Americans and their allies left people behind. They left billions of dollars in American equipment that's now in the hands of the terrorists who can export it to their friends and allies in the Middle East and other places, which endangers Israel. In other words, what the Americans did in Afghanistan endangers Israel. That's why I've mentioned this subject quite often, more than I generally talk about foreign affairs. So the people in the United States have a glaring, or the Congress, I should say, has a glaring lack of understanding of a country's obligations to its citizens. Every country has an obligation, not a right, to defend its citizens. And that is why what the Americans did in Afghanistan so seriously affects the Middle East and Israel in particular. So our government has a tremendous responsibility to figure out what to do without America's support. Having said all that, thanks for listening. Till next time, Jay Shapiro signing off.
If you love Israel News Talk Radio, then you'll love our Facebook page. We keep you up to date on what's happening in Israel, plus little surprise treasures that we don't share on the radio. Go now to follow us on Facebook. Just look for the Israel News Talk Radio Facebook page, and don't forget to subscribe and follow us by clicking on the like button. We post great stuff there that you'll want to share. Israel News Talk Radio on Facebook and Israel News Radio on Twitter.
If you're hearing this message, everyone else can too. Advertise with Israel News Talk Radio and get your message out to people. We'll build a personalized package for you. Contact advertising at israelnewstalkradio.com.
Straight talk from Israel. You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
Hey, this is Jake in Anchorage, Alaska, and I love listening to all the super interesting interviews and up-to-date information on what's happening in Israel.
Hello, this is Anna King, originally from London, now living in Israel. And what can I say? Israel News Talk Radio is my cup of tea.
My name is Bhaskar. I'm from India, and I love listening because you get to know the truth and wonderful voices from this lovely country.
Mom! Okay, wait a minute. Hi, this is Chava Dax, and I'm calling for the rolling hills of Ma'ale Adumim, just north of Jerusalem. I always listen to Israel News Talk Radio to get all the latest news and commentary and to keep me up to date every day.
This is Sarah Dax from Ma'ale Adumim, and I'm 12. I wish Israel News Talk Radio was boring so my mom wouldn't listen to it all the time. Mom!
You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
News, opinion, and more. You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.